James Turner with O'Reilly News here at OSCON 2008. I'm talking to John Lamb, who is the IronRuby guy for Microsoft, or as his badge says, the evil empire for Redmond. So clearly you're taking things with a little bit of a wry sense of humor there.
That's the thing, right? Like if you don't have a sense of humor, right, what do you got in life? You know, so you gotta, you know, especially when you get a chance to talk to people, it's a lot about trying to approach things, you know, on a less confrontational way, right, and that kind of stuff. You know, I mean, making fun of yourself is a great way of doing it.
Well, you certainly are in a role where you're bridging two groups of people who traditionally have been a little bit adversarial to each other.
Yep, on both ways, yeah.
So tell me how you got to Microsoft. And
Sure, so the story was kind of fun. It's to kind of cut it so that the story is over like the last 3 years. I gave a talk at Ruby Fringe last week where I kind of covered the longer talk, right, or the longer history, which is actually a little bit more interesting. But the short history is I built a open source bridge between the Ruby interpreter, the existing Matsu's Ruby interpreter MRI, and the CLR back. I started working on that maybe about 3.5 years ago. And as part of my promotional tour for this thing, I went around and spoke at a bunch of conferences, including this one here at OSCON back in, I think it was 2005. And I really wanted to kind of present my work to the world because it was cool. It lets you use .NET objects and Ruby objects side by side inside of the same process. So for all intents and purposes, a .NET object would look and feel and smell and taste just like a Ruby object. And so that work was done here. That was at the same time, this was when IronPython was going 1.0 here at the conference. And so I knew Jim Huguenin from a long time ago. He was the guy that created IronPython, and he works for Microsoft as well now. And so what happened was, well, they took me into the back room, they shone the bright lights in me, you know, sticks and a little bit of mind conditioning. Got me to at least go for an interview loop at Microsoft in a few months, and I did that, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, which was an awful lot of fun. I got a chance to go off and build a Ruby implementation from scratch, build a team from scratch, build it as an open source project, and also have this opportunity to create this platform for building Ruby applications on top of, which is this thing we call Silverlight today. Back then it was called a crazy bunch of code names. And the fascinating thing about that was, you know, it was an opportunity to build a truly cross-platform version of Ruby in the sense that Ruby on Windows is kind of treated as a second-class citizen, you know, but through the Silverlight platform we have the ability to run Windows as well as on Mac as well as on Linux via the Moonlight project. So we have this consistent platform everywhere where folks that go off and build Ruby applications, you know, will have this opportunity to go off and use things in interesting scenarios.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the CLR and exactly what that is and what it brings? Because for a lot of people, I think, you know, they hear bytecode, they hear .NET, they hear Mono, and their eyes glaze. So
CLR is just like the JVM, right? Since people certainly know an awful lot more about Java in the open source world. It's a runtime. It is a virtual machine. It offers a lot of the same kinds of services that you'll find on the JVM. There's a JIT compiler. You know, there's a bytecode verifier, or we call it IL. And you know, it's a fast platform essentially where it tries to abstract away details of the underlying platform. It also presents a bunch of services that make it easier for people to write applications like garbage collection.
And a technology like IronRuby, how does that leverage the CLR, and what benefits does that bring to Ruby developers? So
what's interesting is that designing a language or building and implementing a language is actually the easy part. The much more difficult part is, you know, getting it to be secure, getting it to run in multiple places, putting in things like a world-class garbage collector or just-in-time compiler. Those are things that take an awful lot of work, and it seems like every single programming language reinvents some kind of virtual machine environment for them to go off and do these things. Ruby is no different. So today there's two acronymed implementations of Ruby that are kind of like the original Ruby. So MRI, which is Matsu's Ruby implementation, and KRI, which is Koichi's Ruby implementation. KRI is otherwise known as Ruby 1.9, where Koichi created his own VM. And just like all the other people have gone before them, they've gone off and created their own VM. And VMs, as it turns out, are a very, very difficult task. Not to say that I don't think the stuff that they're doing is awesome, but the reality is there's an awful lot of engineering work that has to go into building a virtual machine. You know, in the order of thousands of person years, certainly in the mature virtual machines that we have in the world, like the JVM or the CLR. And, you know, so it's just not realistic, you know, for a small, you know, 2-3 man team like what Koichi has there to go off and build, you know, an implementation of the same robustness and performance. So really what IronRuby does is, so there's actually another piece of technology that my team builds at Microsoft, and it's this thing that we call the dynamic language runtime, or the DLR. The DLR is started off originally as the Python language runtime. So IronPython was this implementation of Python that was built from scratch on top of the CLR. And building it from scratch turned out to be harder than it should have been. Now, not harder in that, oh my God, it was impossible, harder in the sense that in order to build a high-performance implementation, you had to make lots and lots and lots of little decisions and make them all correctly. And as it turns out, if you make that set of things, those set of decisions correctly, you'll wind up with a very fast implementation. So certainly, you know, in terms of throughput, IronPython is the fastest implementation of Python today. So given that, oh gee, it was awesome that we could do this, but gosh, it was really hard to do this, we thought that it would be a really great idea to abstract out the hard stuff, things like dynamic method dispatch, into a set of libraries that could be used by other compiler implementers. So that was the idea around the DLR. To vet the idea, we decided to go off and build 3 other languages outside of Python. So we built an internal prototype of a version of Visual Basic. We called it VBX. We built an implementation of JavaScript, and we also built IronRuby. Right? So those are 3 projects that built on top of the DLR. And effectively what that happened was it kind of forced all the Pythonisms out of the DLR, since it originally really started off as a Python language runtime.
Well, that's what happens when you refactor, is all the little niche things come out into the calling.
Yes, yes. So, you know, so that was a lot of the things that we wound up doing, and it was, you know, I think that we're vetting the idea quite well. You know, the DLR is actually going to wind up being part of, you know, shipping Microsoft stuff, right? So in the sense that, you know, DLR is going to ship with Windows, and you know, sometime in the future it's going to ship with our tools and our platforms and that kind of stuff, so that, you know, it effectively becomes just like the CLR. So folks that want to go build a language can expect on it, you know, being available and deployed very widely.
One of the concerns that people had a lot when Java was first implemented by Microsoft was, oh, they're going to poison it in a way that it will no longer be a compatible language. And I think there's similar concerns with IronPython and IronRuby, that you're going to end up with non-portable programs.
You know, and those are, so, you know, what was it? Trying to come up with a pithy quote around, you know, talk is cheap, right? And you know, certainly anyone can go off and talk about things and say, oh my God, well, this could happen and that could happen. The only way you can judge us, and the only way anyone can judge us, is based on what our actions are, as opposed to what we say or what other people say. So if you look at the actions of IronPython and you look inside of the Python community at large, right? IronPython is a very well-respected implementation of Python. Nobody has seen any evidence at all of some, you know, G# thing or something else. So, you know, and it's the same thing with IronRuby, right? IronRuby had exactly the same set of, you know, doubts at the beginning. I tend to clip out those old articles and stuff, right? You know, that's a good motivational thing for the team. You know, a lot of people doubted us, but as I said, right, what you have to do is you have to go off and you gotta develop a thick skin. You gotta go off and do your work. You gotta show what you're doing. You gotta show up again. You gotta show up again. You gotta show up again. You gotta go show your progress and the rest of that, right? Anything I say, right? I wouldn't expect anybody to believe me outside of, like, judge us based on where we are right now, and judge us based on, you know, our kind of past achievements. And if you look at what's going on in the Ruby community, there are today 7 different funded implementations of Ruby, and most of them have corporate backing of some sort, and you know, so there's already this, you know, called balkanization of Ruby that's happening, right? In the sense that, you know, each one of these things has the potential, right, to go off and veer off in some direction. Now, some of these things are due to the fact that, like a lot of other open source languages, and scripting languages in particular, not just open source, that's too broad of a category. Scripting languages generally don't have a specification, right? You know, JavaScript is the exception to the rule, where there is actually a specification for how it's supposed to behave in the only things that really matter to implementers, which are in all the weird corner cases where features combine together.
Right, but like in Perl 6 is everything that fit into the bucket.
Sure.
Right.
And so right now, there's rumors of, a standardization process for Ruby kicking off, out of Japan and going, to ISO. And that's Matza said that he would like to see this happen. That's awesome, right? But that's years away, as anyone that's ever done any standards work knows. So in the short term, what we have in the community is a project called the RubySpec project, which grew up out of one of the 7 implementations called Rubinius. And so the RubySpec project is an attempt by the community to go off and define a set of unit tests that define what is and what isn't Ruby.
So that's like the Java standard, I don't remember what they call it, but they've got a standard test suite yet to run in order to get the cert.
Yeah, and unfortunately there's not going to be a certification. I don't know what's going to happen long term around this stuff.
But it's the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
If you're going to call if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck.
Exactly.
So it's interesting to watch what seems to be a transition inside of Microsoft from the evil cancer days of open source at Microsoft to what we see today. We get Sarah Ford over at the Open Source Lab and IronPython and IronRuby, and what seems to be a much more, I don't know if maybe accepting is the right word, attitude by Microsoft toward, or maybe resigned, toward the fact that open source is going to be a part of the landscape. What is the feel that you get as kind of an open sourcey guy inside of the corporation?
So there's several parts that I find really interesting about that question. So one of them is the fact that the reality is for all of our enterprise customers, enterprise being large organizations, open source is a fact of life there, right? The Fortune 500, virtually every single last one of those guys have some amount of open source inside of their IT infrastructure. So certainly, the things that we have to do with respect to interop, playing nice with the other things are just things that help our customers, do better, and then ultimately, keep them as customers. So, so there's this thing where, we certainly have to do this interoperability thing. The second thing really is that if you think about programming languages, IDEs to a certain extent, or to perhaps even a larger extent these days in frameworks, almost all of that stuff is being commoditized, right? You will find it's very, very hard to go off and find, say, let's take programming languages, somebody selling a compiler today, right? I'm sure there are a few in niche areas.
Sun was the last ones who really tried to make a living off their C compiler, and GCC ate their lunch.
Yeah, almost everyone. We still technically make money off of our C++ compiler, but there's so many different ways that you can get it for free that, like somebody's going to pay for it, but most people, if you care to, could get the thing for free. And so the reality now is since, it's commoditized generally, things like, frameworks and languages. Well, how do you monetize this stuff, right? Some people service models, but we're not a services company really, right? We're a platforms company. So the question that you generally have to ask is, does this thing that we are open sourcing somehow contribute value or increase the value on some underlying platform that we make money off of, right? And that's just the way we do business. And that's it. So at least where I sit at Microsoft in developer division, that's a really easy thing to make the argument for, since virtually everything we do at developer division is all about our underlying platforms. So, for folks at other parts of the company, right, it's a very different set of decisions, right? Like things like, you're not going to see Windows or Office open source anytime soon for that same set of reasons. They are a platform we make money off of.
Right, it's the core competency.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make any jokes there. But I've always thought it was kind of ironic that you had this very negative attitude toward open source for a while at Microsoft, because practically from Windows 3.1, as soon as they put the WinSock stack in, you had Berkeley traceroute in there and all these other open source that were allowed to be used because they were under a Berkeley license, technologies that were in Windows. So it always seemed a little weird to me.
Well, in some ways I also find it interesting in the sense that a lot of programmers believe they understand intellectual property, right? And I think the bigger, my part-time job at Microsoft is understanding intellectual property, because so much of what I do is all around, dealing with lawyers and dealing with things to get our stuff out there. And I understand. So there are a perfectly rational and reasonable set of arguments that kind of define our position around intellectual property, things that you'll hear people talking about. And there are perfectly sound and rational arguments why it doesn't make sense at all. Like, there are two sides to this thing, and I think what we're seeing is an opportunity where we're gonna push the ball a little bit harder each time, or a little bit higher each time. We're gonna look around after taking that step, and say, well, did that work, right? Was there some positive benefit by doing that? If so, yeah, right, that's awesome. Company's still around, he's still making money, check, that looks good. So if we are able to continually push the envelope a lot of this stuff, and we have certainly come an awful long way if you kind of look at where we came from originally, we'll see more and more of this stuff coming out of the company, in the future.
So apart from being an open source guy in what was until recently a very commercial software space.
We are still very commercial. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well,
you mean the languages?
Less than it was. What's Microsoft like these days?
It's an awesome. So I'm a guy that, I'm 40 years old. I got 2 kids, wife, mortgage, dog, right, all that kind of stuff, and for a guy like me, Microsoft is an awesome place to work, right? We certainly have phenomenal benefits for the families. Seattle, we live in Redmond, is a stunningly beautiful place to live. So as a company, right, for me personally, it's been an awesome experience. I also get to go to work every day with some really, really smart people, right? My team is fantastic. Easily the best set of developers I've ever worked with, period. So that kind of, experience where you get to go to work each day and work with awesome people and do cool things, right? What more could you really ask for?
Is IronRuby still very open to community contribution? Or?
We've, since last year where we announced that we were accepting our community contributions here at OSCON, we've gotten community contributions. We're as open as anyone wants us to be. Folks just simply need to go off and submit a patch to our thing. We'll review it. If it's good, we'll check it in.
O'Reilly even has a book on it?
All right, well, John, it's been great talking to you, and thanks for some insight into open source inside of Microsoft, or the evil empire as your badge says. We'll be talking to John Lamb, who is the IronRuby guy at Microsoft and here at OSCON 2008.